The universe had seen wars. 10,000 years of unending slaughter had seen to that. Worlds burned in the names of gods, both false and terrible. Oceans boiled. Stars were extinguished by weapons that should not exist, wielded by hands that should not be. The 41st millennium was not a time of heroes. It was a time of survival dressed in the armor of purpose, a civilization held together by faith, fear, and the blood of countless billions who died so that countless billions more might live another day in ignorance of how close the end truly was. But even in this age of ruin, there were things that did not belong. Not demons. Demons belonged here, crawling through the cracks between reality and the howling madness of the warp. Not Xenos. Aliens had their place in the grand, terrible ecology of a dying galaxy. Not even Chaos Marines, those twisted monuments to humanity's capacity for self-destruction. No, what did not belong was something older than the Imperium's theology, something that had survived a war that made the Long War look like a border skirmish, something that had been forged in the crucible of absolute annihilation and come out the other side not broken, not corrupted, not elevated, just angrier. His name, in the records of a civilization that no longer existed, was the Doomslayer. He arrived on the world of Caelum Tertius at 0300 hours Imperial Standard Time, during the third week of a Khornate incursion that had already reduced 2 of the planet's 5 hive cities to rubble and bone. He arrived not in a drop pod, not through a warp translation, not via any means the Mechanicus Auspex arrays could categorize or record. One moment, the sky above Sector 19 was empty. The next, something fell from it, trailing fire that was not quite fire, leaving a crater 30 meters wide in what had once been a manufactorum district. The ground shook. Dust and pulverized ferrocrete billowed outward in a ring. 3 Khornate Berserkers, who had been advancing through the rubble, were knocked from their feet by the shockwave. They recovered quickly. Berserkers always did. Their gene-enhanced bodies healed at rates that mocked mortal medicine. Their minds long since scoured clean of anything that was not blood hunger. They rose from the rubble, a chain axes screaming, and turned toward the crater. What looked back at them from within, it was not a demon. It was not a space marine. It was a figure in dark armor, ancient in design, utterly alien in aesthetic. Every surface scratched and scored and repaired and scratched again by weapons beyond counting. The helmet was sealed, expressionless, 2 pale lenses catching the firelight of a burning city. The figure was large, but not Astartes large, not superhuman in any visible, categorical way. It stood slowly, deliberately. It looked at the 3 berserkers. It looked at the burning city beyond them. It looked at the skulls mounted on the berserkers' armor, trophies from the fallen, meaningless decoration to the warriors who wore them, evidence of a god's appetite. Something shifted in the quality of the silence. The first berserker charged with a roar that shook dust from collapsed walls. A chain axe capable of splitting ceramite screamed through the air in a diagonal cut that would have bisected a normal human at the waist. The figure sidestepped it, not frantically, not desperately, with the casual economy of something that had seen 10,000 variations of that exact swing and had stopped finding them interesting somewhere around the 1,000th repetition. The dodge became a pivot. The pivot became a grab. The Berserker's momentum was used against it. The massive warrior redirected into the Ferrocrete wall, hard enough to crack the surface and collapse a section of ruin on top of its head. The second Berserker was already mid-swing. A weapon came up to meet it, a shotgun-like instrument that, on closer inspection, was nothing any Mechanicus forge had ever produced, loaded with shells that detonated on impact with a concussive force entirely disproportionate to their size. The Berserker was thrown backward. It was already healing, already rising. The figure closed the distance in 2 steps and introduced the Berserker to a sequence of violence so efficient it could only have been developed through practice measured in geological time. The third Berserker died before it fully processed that the first 2 were down. Silence returned to Sector 19. The figure stood in the crater it had made. It looked at the dead Berserkers. Then it looked at the city again, at the distant sounds of screaming, of chain axes, of weapons fired in the desperate language of people who knew they were losing. The helmet tilted slightly, processing, assessing. Then the Doomslayer walked toward the sound of battle, and Caelum Tertius would never be the same. If you crave stories of impossible collisions and the warriors who refuse to fall, smash that subscribe button and join the crusade. Because in the 41st millennium, the most dangerous thing isn't a god. It's the one who doesn't fear them. The Khornate incursion on Caelum Tertius had been, by the standards of the 41st millennium, a textbook operation. Warband designation, the Crimson Tithe. Commanded by the Chaos Lord Varic the Unbroken, a former Iron Warriors captain who had spent 3 centuries offering skulls to the blood god with the systematic efficiency of his old legion and the savage joy of his new one. 8,000 Berserkers, 40 Chaos Space Marines of veteran grade, 6 Defiler Walkers, in 2 brass Scorpion war engines, and somewhere in the upper atmosphere, the strike cruiser Ruin Made Holy waiting to extract what Varic deemed worth extracting from the planet's burning bones. By the end of the 4th hour after the crater's appearance in Sector 19, Varic had lost 216 Berserkers. He did not initially believe the reports. Berserkers did not die in those numbers to a single combatant. The mathematics were simply wrong. Even an Eversor assassin, those barely contained human weapons that the Imperium deployed when it wanted a problem dissolved rather than solved, burned out after a concentrated engagement. Even a Space Marine hero of legendary status would take casualties in return for casualties given. The kill-to-loss ratio his Vox operators were relaying to him was not the ratio of a battle. It was the ratio of a malfunction, a machine error. Someone had miscounted. He sent a champion to investigate. Brother Gareth the Flensed, 8 feet of chaos-blessed murder with a power fist, and 3 centuries of service to the blood god. Gareth did not report back. Varic went himself. He found Gareth's power fist, just the power fist. The rest of Gareth was distributed across approximately 40 meters of rubble in a pattern that suggested someone had used him as a weapon against the warriors he had been sent to reinforce. The surrounding area contained the evidence of a systematic, almost contemptuous dismantling of his forces, not the frenzied carnage of a demon or the precise execution of an assassin, but something in between. Something that moved through his warriors like a calculation. Like an answer to a question his berserkers had been asking their entire lives without knowing it. What happens when something hits back harder? Varic found the figure 3 blocks deeper into Sector 19, reloading a weapon over the body of a defiler. The defiler, a demon engine the size of a building, armored in possessed metal, capable of leveling a hab block with a single volley, had been reduced to component parts. Its demonic inhabitant had been expelled from its housing in a manner the Chaos Lord could not immediately explain. The figure was extracting something from the wreckage: ammunition. It was looting the demon engine for parts it could use. Varic had served Khorne for 300 years. He had killed Space Marine commanders and Imperial generals and Xenos warlords. He had walked through fields of the dead so vast they blotted out planetary horizons. He understood carnage on a scale that would obliterate a normal human mind. He felt, for the first time in a very long time, something he almost didn't recognize: unease. "What are you?" he called across the rubble field, because Varic was many things, but he was not, at his core, a fool. The figure stopped, turned. The pale lenses found him across 200 meters of broken city without difficulty. There was a pause, not hesitation, but assessment. The pause of something deciding whether this particular problem required a weapon change. Varic raised his own weapon, a combi bolter of Heresy-era manufacture, modified across centuries with blessings and components that made it as much icon as instrument. "I asked you a question. Khorne respects a warrior who answers honestly." The figure said nothing. "You've killed over 200 of my warriors," Varic continued. He was moving now, slowly, flanking without appearing to flank. "Old habits. Khorne is pleased with you. Do you understand what that means? The blood god doesn't offer favor lightly. What you've done here, the skulls you've taken, they've reached the brass throne. He's noticed you." The figure tilted its head, the same fractional tilt it had given the burning city when it arrived. Then it raised the weapon it had been reloading, not at Varic, past him, at the 4 berserkers that had been circling through the rubble, approaching from angles carefully calculated to put the figure in a crossfire. The berserkers Varic had positioned before he called out, his insurance policy: 4 shots, 4 bodies. The figure lowered the weapon and looked at Varic again. The message was extraordinarily clear. "I saw them the moment they moved. I let you finish talking first." Varic laughed. He couldn't help it. It was the laugh of a man who had found something genuinely surprising for the first time in decades. "Oh," he said. "Oh, Khorne is going to love you." The next 30 seconds were among the most violent in Sector 19's already catastrophically violent evening. Varic was exceptional. 3 centuries of war had made him something beyond even the standard of Chaos Space Marines. Faster, stronger, more savage than his frame suggested. His combi bolter and his relic blade worked in concert with the efficiency of long practice and dark blessing. The Doomslayer put him through 2 walls and a collapsed ceiling and left him breathing, barely, in the rubble. Not because he couldn't finish it, because something in the broken city was calling louder. More of them. More skulls for a throne he didn't recognize, in service of a god he hadn't met yet. He walked past Varac's broken form and moved deeper into the city. And above the planet, in the warp-touched void between stars, something vast and ancient and made entirely of rage turned its attention downward and smiled. The Astra Militarum called them the ghosts of Caelum, the 14th Cadian remnant, what remained of a full regiment after 3 weeks of Khornate assault had reduced 12,000 soldiers to 941. They held the line at the Tertius Manufactorum belt because there was no one else to hold it, because the reinforcement ships were 14 days out, and because Colonel Isult Marev had decided that dying while standing was preferable to dying while running, and that her soldiers would do the former before she permitted the latter. Marev was 47 years old, born on Cadia before the 13th Black Crusade had unmade it, and she carried the weight of that loss the way Cadians always did, not as grief, which was a luxury, but as fuel. She had gray eyes the color of lasgun discharge and a scar across her jaw from a chain axe she had survived by refusing to accept that she shouldn't have. Her command post was a reinforced basement 3 levels beneath the manufactorum floor, lit by emergency lumens and the constant glow of a Vox bank that delivered nothing but bad news with remarkable consistency. The report that reached her at 0700 hours was not bad news. It was something else entirely, a category of information her experience had not prepared her to file. "Say that again," she told Vox Officer Denel, who looked like he very much wished he didn't have to. "Auspex confirms, Colonel. Sector 19, 231 Khornate Berserkers. Confirmed dead, 6 defilers, destroyed. 1 Chaos Lord, status unknown, last seen." Denel checked his readout. "Being put through a structural wall by an unidentified combatant. 1 combatant. 1. Colonel?" Marev looked at her map. Sector 19 was 3 kilometers from her position. The Khornate advance had been pressing from the north for 6 hours. Whatever had happened in Sector 19 had stopped that advance. Not slowed it, not redirected it, stopped it. Which meant that whatever was in Sector 19 was currently more frightening to 8,000 blood god worshipping maniacs than the prospect of dishonoring their patron deity by retreating. That was either the best news she'd received in 3 weeks, or the beginning of a problem that made the Khornate invasion look manageable. She took 4 veterans and went to look. They found the trail easily enough. It wasn't subtle. A path of systematic destruction moved through the sector from the impact crater, which Marev's combat instincts immediately registered as a landing site, not an artillery strike, because the debris pattern was wrong for an explosion, through 3 blocks of urban terrain, and the further they followed it, the more the destruction changed in character. Early in the trail, there were bodies consistent with a single combatant engaging multiple enemies simultaneously. Adaptive, reactive, The work of something that was, at the outset, calibrating. Deeper in, the destruction became almost contemptuous. Groups of berserkers had been engaged and dismantled in sequences that her veteran eye could reconstruct from the evidence. This group had tried to flank. The combatant had already moved. This group had tried suppressing fire. The combatant had advanced into it, which was either suicidal or a statement about how seriously they took the threat of the weapons being used against them. This defiler had tried to bring its battle cannon to bear at close range. The cannon was currently embedded in the defiler's own chassis. Trooper Harsk, her best scout and a man of few words and precise observations, crouched over a set of boot prints in the ash and dried blood and said, "One set of tracks throughout, consistent weight and stride, doesn't vary. Whatever this is, it wasn't scared." "Nothing that killed this many berserkers had any right to be," Marev said. They found him at the northern edge of Sector 19. It's at the border where the Manufactorum Belt met an ancient hive transit station. The platform still intact, though the trains had stopped running when the incursion began. He was standing at the edge of a platform overlooking the lower city, and below the platform, the northern approach was carpeted with Khornate dead. He hadn't heard them coming, or he had, and simply didn't consider them worth turning around for. Marev decided after a moment's observation that it was the latter. The way he stood, weight forward, ready, head moving in slow assessment arcs across the terrain below, was the posture of something that was always tracking the most significant threat in any given environment, and had determined that 9 tired guardsmen at his back did not qualify. "Stand down your weapons," Marev said quietly to her squad, because she was practical, and because if this thing had killed 231 berserkers, her lasguns were a statement rather than a deterrent. She stepped forward alone. "I'm Colonel Isult Marev, 14th Cadian Remnant, Astra Militarum. I'd like to know what you are and whose side you're on." The figure turned. She got her first clear look at him in the gray morning light, filtering through smoke and ash. The armor was remarkable, old in ways she couldn't quantify, carrying the accumulated evidence of wars she had no frame of reference for. The helmet revealed nothing. The weapons holstered and slung across the armored frame were foreign in manufacture, but obviously, unmistakably, weapons. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her 9 soldiers. Then at the bodies of her regiment's enemies carpeting the approach below. He did not speak, but he stepped aside from the platform edge, fractionally, in a gesture that her soldiers' instincts read immediately. "Look at what I've done. Decide what that means." "Throne," whispered Harsk behind her. From the north, the Khornate advance was reorganizing. She could hear it, the distant thunder of engines, the howling of the blood gods faithful finding their courage again, or their madness, which in berserkers amounted to the same thing. Somewhere in the vox chatter crackling through her earpiece, she heard the word being passed between Imperial positions. "Something is in Sector 19. Don't engage it. Don't approach it." The Inquisition had arrived on Caelum Tertius. The Astra Militarum called them the Ghosts of Caelum. The 14th Cadian Remnant, what remained of a full regiment after 3 weeks of Khornate assault had reduced 12,000 soldiers to 941. They held the line at the Tertius Manufactorum belt because there was no one else to hold it, because the reinforcement ships were 14 days out, and because Colonel Iseult Marev had decided that dying while standing was preferable to dying while running, and that her soldiers would do the former before she permitted the latter. Marev was 47 years old, born on Cadia before the 13th Black Crusade had unmade it, and she carried the weight of that loss the way Cadians always did, not as grief, which was a luxury, but as fuel. She had gray eyes the color of lasgun discharge and a scar across her jaw from a chain axe she had survived by refusing to accept that she shouldn't have. Her command post was a reinforced basement 3 levels beneath the manufactorum floor, lit by emergency lumens and the constant glow of a Vox bank that delivered nothing but bad news with remarkable consistency. The report that reached her at 0700 hours was not bad news. It was something else entirely. A category of information her experience had not prepared her to file. "Say that again," she told Vox Officer Denel, who looked like he very much wished he didn't have to. "Auspex confirms, Colonel. Sector 19, 231 Khornate Berserkers. Confirmed dead. 6 Defilers destroyed. 1 Chaos Lord, status unknown, last seen." Denel checked his readout. "Being put through a structural wall by an unidentified combatant. 1 combatant. 1, de Colonel." Marev looked at her map. Sector 19 was 3 kilometers from her position. The Khornate advance had been pressing from the north for 6 hours. Whatever had happened in Sector 19 had stopped that advance. Not slowed it, not redirected it, stopped it. Which meant that whatever was in Sector 19 was currently more frightening to 8,000 blood god worshipping maniacs than the prospect of dishonoring their patron deity by retreating. That was either the best news she'd received in 3 weeks, or the beginning of a problem that made the Khornate invasion look manageable. She took 4 veterans and went to look. They found the trail easily enough. It wasn't subtle. A path of systematic destruction moved through the sector from the impact crater, which Marev's combat instincts immediately registered as a landing site, not an artillery strike, because the debris pattern was wrong for an explosion. Through 3 blocks of urban terrain, and the further they followed it, the more the destruction changed in character. Early in the trail, there were bodies consistent with a single combatant engaging multiple enemies simultaneously. Adaptive, reactive. The work of something that was, at the outset, calibrating. Deeper in, the destruction became almost contemptuous. Groups of berserkers had been engaged and dismantled in sequences that her veteran eye could reconstruct from the evidence. This group had tried to flank. The combatant had already moved. This group had tried suppressing fire. The combatant had advanced into it, which was either suicidal or a statement about how seriously they took the threat of the weapons being used against them. This defiler had tried to bring its battle cannon to bear at close range. The cannon was currently embedded in the defiler's own chassis. Trooper Harsk, her best scout and a man of few words and precise observations, crouched over a set of boot prints in the ash and dried blood and said, "One set of tracks throughout, consistent weight and stride. Doesn't vary. Whatever this is, it wasn't scared. Nothing that killed this many berserkers had any right to be," Marev said. They found him at the northern edge of Sector 19, at the border where the Manufactorum Belt met an ancient hive transit station. The platform still intact, though the trains had stopped running when the incursion began. He was standing at the edge of a platform overlooking the lower city, and below the platform, the northern approach was carpeted with Khornate dead. He hadn't heard them coming, or he had, and simply didn't consider them worth turning around for. Marev decided after a moment's observation that it was the latter. The way he stood, weight forward, ready, head moving in slow assessment arcs across the terrain below, was the posture of something that was always tracking the most significant threat in any given environment, and had determined that 9 tired guardsmen at his back did not qualify. "Stand down your weapons," Marev said quietly to her squad, because she was practical, and because if this thing had killed 231 berserkers, her lasguns were a statement rather than a deterrent. She stepped forward alone. "I'm Colonel Isolt Marev, 14th Cadian Remnant, Astra Militarum. I'd like to know what you are and whose side you're on." The figure turned. She got her first clear look at him in the gray morning light filtering through smoke and ash. The armor was remarkable, old in ways she couldn't quantify, carrying the accumulated evidence of wars she had no frame of reference for. The helmet revealed nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her 9 soldiers. Then at the bodies of her regiment's enemies carpeting the approach below. He did not speak, but he stepped aside from the platform edge, fractionally, in a gesture that her soldiers' instincts read immediately. "Look at what I've done. Decide what that means." "Throne," whispered Harsk behind her. From the north, the Khornate advance was reorganizing. She could hear it, the distant thunder of engines, the howling of the blood gods faithful finding their courage again, or their madness, which in berserkers amounted to the same thing. Somewhere in the vox chatter crackling through her earpiece, she heard the word being passed between Imperial positions. "Something is in Sector 19. Don't engage it. Don't approach it." The Inquisition had arrived on Caelum Tertius. Inquisitor Valdris Crane of the Ordo Malleus had seen things that would have dissolved a lesser mind like acid through parchment. He had witnessed demon primarchs walking in the flesh. He had stood in the aftermath of tyrannid consumption events where entire biospheres had been reduced to stripped rock. He had personally executed a possessed cardinal whose body had been used as a doorway for something from the warp's deepest layers, and he had done it with a bolt pistol and no hesitation, because hesitation in his profession was another word for death. He arrived on Caelum Tertius with a retinue of 6 acolytes, 2 Grey Knights in Terminator plate, and a data slate containing every auspec's reading, Vox intercept, and battlefield report generated in the 12 hours since the crater appeared in Sector 19. He had read the complete file twice during atmospheric entry, and was now reading it a third time because the numbers kept refusing to make sense. 231 berserkers, 6 defilers, 1 chaos lord reduced to critical condition, 1 unidentified combatant. The Grey Knights, brothers Aldrich and Saravos, veterans of the Chamber Militant, who between them had destroyed 11 greater demons and were not given to dramatic statements, had read the same file and produced the following assessment. Threat designation unknown. Approach with maximum force authorization. Crane's own assessment was more nuanced and considerably more disturbing. Something arrived through a dimensional rift generated by chaos ritual. It is not chaos. It is not Imperial. It is not any Xenos classification in our records. It has been in the 41st millennium for less than 12 hours and has already done more damage to a Khornate warband than a full company of Space Marines could reasonably guarantee. It has not attacked Imperial forces. It has not communicated. It has not stopped moving. The last point was the one that kept pulling his attention. The Auspex trail didn't stop, didn't pause for more than minutes at a time. Whatever this was, it had arrived in the middle of a war zone and simply continued, as though the transition between dimensions was an inconvenience on the level of a delayed transit connection rather than an event that should have been, by any reasonable physiological standard, catastrophically disorienting. That spoke to one of two things. Either this being was so powerful that dimensional transit was genuinely trivial to it, in which case the Grey Knight's maximum force authorization was a comfort rather than a solution, or it had done this before. Many times. Had been torn from its native reality and deposited in hostile environments so often that the standard response had become what Crane observed in the Auspex data. Orient, assess, engage the nearest threat, advance. Neither option was comforting. He found Colonel Marev at the transit station and recognized immediately that she was a competent officer doing the mental work of reassessing everything she thought she knew. She gave him a clean debrief. Time, location, observations, the figure's apparent lack of hostility toward Imperial forces, and pointed north along the platform where the trail continued. "It left 20 minutes ago," she said, moving toward the Khornate main force. "Alone?" "It arrived alone." She paused. "I don't think it considers that a problem." Crane looked at the battlefield below the platform. He was a man trained to read scenes of violence the way scholars read texts, extracting meaning from the arrangement of evidence. What he read in the Khornate Dead was not the frenzied work of a demon, which tended toward excessive mutilation and symbolic arrangement. It was not the clean execution of an assassin. It was something in between and beyond both. Combat so efficient, it had its own terrible aesthetic. Every body told the same story. Something came, something engaged, something won, something moved on. No hesitation, no excess, no trophies. That last detail lodged in his mind like a splinter. Khorne's faithful took skulls. That was theology and compulsion simultaneously. The offering of the skull to the brass throne was as automatic for a berserker as breathing, and yet the bodies below had been left intact, heads included. Whatever had killed them had not taken anything, had not honored their god by accident or design, had simply ended them and continued. In 8,000 years of recorded warp theology, Khorne could not find a precedent for a being that killed Khornate warriors in numbers that would please the blood god and offered him nothing in return. "Brother Aldrich," he said quietly. The Grey Knight moved to his side, the psychic blankness of the Terminator armor creating its subtle wrongness in the air around them. "Inquisitor, if this being carries warp energy, any chaos alignment, any demonic taint, you'll sense it." "I've been trying since we arrived," Aldrich said. There was something in his voice that Khorne had never heard from a Grey Knight before, something careful. "There is no warp signature, no chaos taint, no demonic presence." A pause. "But there is something else, something I have no category for, an impression, like..." He stopped. "Like what?" "Like standing next to a fire that has been burning for so long it has forgotten what it was originally lit to illuminate," Aldrich said. "It is not evil, Inquisitor. It is not good. It is something that has been at war for so long that war has become its entire metaphysics." Khorne stared north along the trail for a long moment. Then he made a decision that his training told him was reckless and his instincts told him was necessary. "We follow it," he said. "We observe. We do not engage unless it engages us first." He looked at Aldrich. "And we pray to the Emperor that it continues to point itself at chaos and not at us." From the north, the sounds of renewed slaughter began, different in character from anything the Khornate advance had produced. Faster, more decisive, already fading. It was moving through them like they weren't there. The message came through the warp like a scream through a cathedral, vast, resonant, and impossible to ignore. It arrived not in words exactly, but in the language that predated words, the language of pure intent that demons understood in their marrow, and mortals felt as pressure behind the eyes and copper on the tongue. It propagated outward from the brass throne, through every demonic presence in the Caelum Tertius war zone simultaneously, and what it communicated, stripped to its essential meaning, was this: "Bring it to me. Do not kill it. Bring it to me." Varic the Unbroken received the message in the Medici Bay of the Ruin Made Holy, where his shattered ribs were being reset by a chaos apothecary with more enthusiasm than precision. The message hit him like a second impact, and he sat up despite the apothecary's protests and the grinding complaint of bones not yet healed. And he laughed again, the same laugh he'd produced in Sector 19, yet the laugh of genuine surprise. Khorne wanted it alive. In 300 years of service, Varic had never received that instruction, not once. The blood god's theology was not complicated. Kill, offer the skull, kill more. Capture was a tactic of lesser gods, gods of scheming and patience. The notion of Khorne wanting something preserved was so fundamentally alien to the doctrine of the Crimson Tithe that several of his berserkers, receiving the same message through their own demonic connection, simply couldn't process it and went back to fighting. But Varic understood. He understood because he had stood 200 meters from the thing in Sector 19 and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 centuries. And he understood that Khorne had felt it too, magnified 1,000-fold, felt it the way a god feels things, not as unease, but as appetite. The blood god had found something it wanted to own. The Crane and his retinue tracked the Doomslayer's path through the northern manufactorum districts for 4 hours before they caught up with him, and what they found when they did forced even the Grey Knights to reassess their priors about the upper limits of individual combat effectiveness. The northern approach had been the staging ground for the Khornate main force. 4,000 berserkers, the remaining brass scorpion war engine, and 30 veteran Chaos Marines forming a command cadre around what remained of the warband's leadership structure after Varic's incapacitation. It was, by any standard, a force capable of reducing a fortified city to rubble inside a week. It had been engaged for approximately 2 hours. The brass scorpion was gone, not disabled, gone in the sense that its component parts were now spread across a 4-block radius in a pattern suggesting the war engine had been disassembled under fire, its demonic core expelled and destroyed before the chassis could regenerate around it. The command cadre of veteran Chaos Marines had been reduced to 4 survivors who had retreated to a defensible position in a collapsed underhive transit hub and were, according to the Auspex data, not moving and not advancing, and making the entirely sensible decision to wait for further instructions from a god rather than continue engaging something that had just killed 26 of their number. The Berserkers were another matter. Berserkers did not make sensible decisions. That was, theologically speaking, the point of them. They had continued to advance in waves, which meant that the northern approach was now carpeted in Khornate, dead, in a density that made movement through the area genuinely difficult. The Doomslayer stood at the far edge of the carnage, and he was, Crane noted with the careful attention of a man cataloging something unprecedented, hurt, not badly. The armor had taken impacts that would have killed a space marine. Ceramite would have cracked and shattered under the sustained fire that had clearly been directed at him across 2 hours of continuous engagement. Whatever his armor was made of had bent and scored and dented, and there was a section across the left pauldron where something explosive had stripped away the outer layer entirely, leaving the inner workings exposed. His movements were marginally slower than the Auspex data from Sector 19 suggested was his baseline. Not impaired, adjusted. He was compensating for the damage with the automatic recalibration of a combatant who had been fighting injured so often that it had become another variable to manage rather than a crisis to address. He was also, Crane realized, running low on something. The weapons cycling had changed. More melee, less ranged. The integration of a blade that crackled with an energy the Inquisitor's instruments declined to classify. He was adapting his loadout to his available resources in real time, which meant his supply chain was disrupted. Good, said one part of Crane's mind. The cold, tactical part that evaluated everything as threat or asset. Constraints make things manageable. The other part of his mind, the part that had tracked this being for 4 hours through a trail of absolute devastation, they said, "You watched him do all of this while constrained. Do you genuinely want to see what unconstrained looks like?" "Inquisitor," Brother Saravos, to his left, quietly. "He's seen us." The helmet had turned. The pale lenses found them across 200 meters of Khornate, dead with the same immediate, unhurried precision that Marev had described. The same assessment pause, the same quality of calculation in the stillness. Crane raised one hand, open, palm outward, not a gesture of surrender. The Doomslayer looked at the gray, the sounds of distant vox chatter, the crackle of fires, the groaning of damaged structures settling. A statement of intent. I am not a threat you need to process right now. A long moment passed. The Doomslayer looked at the Grey Knights. He looked at Crane. He looked at the Inquisitor's rosette, that icon of authority that commanded terror and compliance across 1,000,000 worlds. With an expression Crane couldn't see and didn't need to. The body language said everything. He had no idea what that symbol meant, and it wouldn't have mattered if he did. He turned away, began moving east, toward the coordinates his own internal assessment had identified as the origin point of the ritual that had brought him here. Because he had been tracking it since he arrived. Because of course he had. Because the only exit from a place was through the thing that had pulled you in, and the Doomslayer had been finding exits from hells since before the Imperium existed. Crane watched him go, made his decision. "We follow," he said, "and someone get me Colonel Marev on the Vox. We're going to need the guard." The Vox transmission that Colonel Marev received at 1400 hours was not, technically, an order. Inquisitors didn't issue orders to Astra Militarum officers. They issued directives, which were orders wearing more expensive clothing and carrying the implicit threat of an exterminatus request if ignored. Crane's directive was simple: shadow the unidentified combatant moving east through the Manufactorum belt. Maintain 300-meter minimum distance. Do not engage. Report everything. Marev relayed the directive to her company commanders and received, in return, the expressions of soldiers who had survived 3 weeks of Khornate assault and were now being asked to follow something that had done in 12 hours what they hadn't managed in 3 weeks, at a respectful distance. Side? Unknown. Is it going to kill Side? Unknown. Is it going to kill us? It hasn't yet. Right, said Harsk, with the philosophical resignation of a Cadian who had learned to find comfort in low bars. Let's go then. The Space Marines arrived at 1600 hours. They came in Thunderhawks, 3 of them, dropping through the smoke layer in the tight formation pattern of a chapter that trained obsessively and fought with the controlled aggression of warriors who had been engineered for exactly this kind of urban hell. The heraldry on their armor was deep crimson and bone white. The Flesh Tearers, a successor chapter of the Blood Angels, whose reputation for controlled savagery in close quarters was exceeded only by their reputation for the difficulty of maintaining that control. Their captain was a giant called Mordax, 7th Company, 240 years in service, with a death toll that would have satisfied a minor chaos god, and a temperament that his fellow flesh-tearers described, with some understatement, as intense. He had been diverted from a separate engagement in the Caelum system by an Inquisitorial emergency beacon, and had arrived expecting a demonic incursion of unusual severity. What Crane's briefing actually described gave him pause, which for Mordax was the equivalent of a normal human stopping dead in their tracks and questioning every assumption they'd ever made. One combatant, he said, reading the data slate Crane had transmitted. Non-Astartes, non-demonic, has engaged and destroyed the equivalent of a full Khornate company, plus heavy support. Correct, Crane said over the Vox, and you want us to observe. I want you to be present in case the situation escalates beyond current parameters. A pause. Inquisitor, I have reviewed the Auspex data from the northern approach. The situation you are describing is beyond current parameters. Beyond current parameters further then, Crane said, with the flat precision of a man who was aware of the absurdity and had decided to proceed anyway. The combatant appears to be tracking the ritual site. We believe it wants to close the rift that brought it here. Our interests and its interests are aligned. Another pause. Longer. Gee, you're saying we should let it lead, Mordax said. I'm saying we should not get in its way, which is a different thing and also considerably safer. The ritual site was in the Tertius Underhive, 4 levels below the Manufactorum Belt, a cathedral-scale cavern that had been, in better centuries, a water reclamation facility. The Chaos Sorcerer who had converted it to his purposes had spent 6 weeks preparing the space with a thoroughness that spoke to either extraordinary dedication or the kind of madness that mimicked dedication well enough to be functionally identical. His name was Pithrak Sorn, formerly of the Thousand Sons, a sorcerer of the 15th rank whose fall from Magnus's service had been precipitated by an experiment so reckless even his legion standards couldn't accommodate it. He had been operating independently for 40 years, offering his ritual expertise to whatever Chaos Warband would fund his research, and his research had one subject: dimensional transit. Specifically, the controlled importation of entities from adjacent realities for binding and exploitation. The being he had accidentally imported from the Slayer's dimension was not, he was prepared to acknowledge, what he had intended to import. He had intended to summon a demon prince, something powerful, bound by the ritual circle's constraints, exploitable. What he had gotten instead was something the ritual circle had failed to contain, had, in fact, shattered on contact, the binding runes scorching and cracking as the Slayer passed through them with the same indifference he applied to most obstacles, and had been loose in his war zone for 14 hours, doing catastrophic damage to the forces he had been paid to support. Pithrak was, under the sorceress robes and the chaos blessings and the 40 years of independent operation, a pragmatist. He had survived this long by correctly identifying which situations were recoverable and which were not, and then acting on that assessment before other people's optimism got him killed. This situation was not recoverable. He was in the process of preparing an emergency dimensional transit, not for the Slayer, for himself, when the Underhive access tunnel to the west produced sounds that he recognized after a moment's horrified processing as the systematic dismantlement of his outer guard. 40 berserkers, gone in 11 minutes. He had 12 inner guard remaining, Chaos Marines of veteran grade, positioned around the ritual circle with weapons ready. He had his own considerable sorceress power. He had 40 years of survival instinct screaming at him to move. He had none of that ready when the door came off its mountings. The Doomslayer stood in the doorway and looked at the ritual circle. the shattered remains of the binding runes, the dimensional tear still flickering at its center, like a wound that hadn't closed, thin and guttering, but present. He looked at it with the focused attention of someone who had found what they were looking for. Then he looked at Pithrak. The sorcerer's 12 veterans opened fire simultaneously. The Doomslayer walked through it, not metaphorically. He advanced through the combined fire of 12 Chaos Marines with the deliberate, economical movement of something that had done the math on incoming fire and found the answer manageable. His armor absorbed, deflected, and shed impacts that should have cored through ceramite. He moved between firing lines, using the veterans' own crossfire geometry against them. And he did it with a speed that made Pithrak's enhanced chaos-blessed perception struggle to track. In 90 seconds, the 12 veterans were down. The Doomslayer stood in the center of the ritual circle, 3 meters from Pithrak's Khorne, and the dimensional tear flickered between them like a guttering candle. Pithrak raised both hands, not in surrender, but in the gesture of a sorcerer preparing a working of considerable power, and said, "Within 6 hours, and you'll be stranded within 6 hours, and you'll be stranded here permanently. But I can stabilize it, widen it, send you through." He kept his hands up, kept his voice level. "I made a mistake. I'm offering to correct it. That's all." The pale lenses regarded him for a long, still moment. "All I need," Pithrak said carefully, "is for you to not kill me for the next 20 minutes. 20 minutes was, in the context of the Doomslayer's recent operational tempo, an eternity." He stood in the center of the ritual circle and watched Pithrak's Khorne work, and the quality of his attention was the quality of a predator that has not decided yet whether to eat something or simply observe it until it does something interesting. He did not pace. He did not inspect the room. He stood with the absolute stillness of a being that had learned, across campaigns without number, that stillness was a weapon, that enemies revealed themselves to things that appeared to be waiting, and that waiting was just another form of readiness. Pithrak worked quickly. His hands moved through gestures that trailed warplight, his lips producing syllables in a language that had predated the Imperium by millennia, his eyes tracking the dimensional tear with the focused attention of a craftsman assessing damaged materials. He was genuinely skilled, whatever else he was, and the list of what else he was ran long and dark. His technical mastery of dimensional mechanics was not fabricated. The tear responded to his ministrations, stabilizing fractionally, its edges becoming slightly more defined. He was also, the Slayer noted, buying time. Not obviously, not clumsily. The ritual work was real, the progress genuine, but the pace was calibrated, fast enough to demonstrate sincerity, slow enough to extend the window, waiting for something, and something Pithrak had communicated before the Slayer arrived. In the minutes between losing his outer guard and losing his inner guard, through a channel the Slayer had no way to monitor. The Slayer filed this assessment and continued to watch. Above the underhive, the convergence was happening. Crane's retinue approached from the west access tunnel. Marev's guardsmen held the eastern approaches, 900 soldiers spread across 4 entry points with laser guns and heavy weapons trained on anything that moved. Captain Mordax and his flesh-tearers had deployed in a perimeter around the Underhive entrances, and the combination of Astartes' tactical discipline and Cadian defensive instinct had produced, in a remarkably short time, something that looked almost like a coordinated response. Almost. Because from the north, moving through the Underhive's secondary maintenance corridors with the purposeful momentum of a tide coming in, came the Khornate response to their god's directive. Varic the Unbroken had healed. Not fully, the Chaos Apothecary's work had been rushed, and several of his ribs remained structurally compromised, and the arm the Slayer had dislocated had been reset with more speed than care, but sufficiently. He moved at the head of 400 berserkers. He was the last coherent fighting force of the Crimson Tithe, and he moved with the focused intensity of a man who had received a direct communication from his god and understood that this was not a battle for skulls. This was a retrieval operation. The conflict in the corridors began simultaneously from 3 directions and produced the kind of layered chaos that military theorists described in training simulations and actual soldiers described in considerably more visceral language. Flesh-tearers engaged berserkers at the northern Underhive entrance and immediately discovered that the Khornate forces were fighting with unusual restraint, pushing forward, not massacring, trying to move through rather than destroy. Mordax recognized the tactical implication in seconds. They had an objective. They were not here to fight the Imperium. The Imperium was an obstacle between them and something else. This did not make them less dangerous. It made them more efficient. In the eastern corridors, Marev's guardsmen encountered Chaos Marines moving in disciplined fire teams, and the discipline was its own kind of message. These were not frenzied worshippers. These were veterans executing a mission parameter. Her heavy weapons teams opened up, and the corridors became charnel houses in both directions, and she moved her line forward because she was Cadian, and forward was the only direction she had ever fully trusted. Incrane reached the ritual chamber door at minute 14. He came through it with both Grey Knights flanking him and his bolt pistol drawn, and he took in the scene with the rapid, comprehensive assessment of a man trained to process extreme situations quickly. The ritual circle, the dimensional tear, the sorcerer working on it, and the armored figure standing in the center of it all, turning now to face the new arrivals with the same unhurried assessment it applied to everything. "Inquisitor," said Brother Aldrich, very quietly. "The tear is real. It leads somewhere that is not the warp." "I know what it is," Crane said. He looked at Pithrak. "Stop." The sorcerer's hand stilled. He turned, and his expression was that of a man doing rapid calculations about which of the threats in the room was most immediately lethal and in which order he should address them. "The ritual is nearly complete," Pethrak said. 20 minutes, as promised. I am returning what I took. Surely that aligns with Imperial interests." "What aligns with Imperial interests," Crane said, "is that I decide what leaves and what stays and what gets handed to the Grey Knights for thorough examination." He looked at the Doomslayer directly. And what I have not yet determined is whether sending this being back through that tier serves the Imperium or simply solves a problem for chaos. The Doomslayer looked at him, looked at the tier, looked back at Khorne. Khorne pressed forward because the sounds from the corridors were getting closer, and he had approximately 90 seconds before this conversation was interrupted by several hundred Khornate Berserkers. "If Khorne wants you," he said, speaking slowly and clearly to something he wasn't certain understood Gothic, but was certain understood intent. "Then sending you home might be exactly what chaos doesn't want, which means it might be exactly what I should prevent." He let that sit for 3 seconds. Then, "Or it might be that the only thing standing between this planet and complete Khornate conquest is the fact that you're still on it. In which case, I should let you go before the situation reaches a point of no return." The pale lenses regarded him with an expression Khorne couldn't see and didn't need to. The body language said, "You're thinking about this the right way. Keep going." "So, I need to know," Khorne said, and the sounds from the corridors were very close now, and the door behind him shuddered from an impact on the other side. "Which is it?" The Doomslayer looked at the door, looked at the tier, looked at Khorne. Then he turned to Pethrak and made a gesture, precise, unambiguous, that the sorcerer interpreted correctly after a moment's processing. "Finish it." "But not yet." Pethrak's hands resumed their motion, slower now, holding the tier at stable dimensions without widening it further. The door came off its mountings. What came through the door was not a tide. It was a focused point. Varic, the Unbroken, alone, moving ahead of his berserkers with the deliberate intent of a man who had something to prove, and a god watching him prove it. He was impressive, even broken and reset, and moving with the careful management of a body not yet fully healed. He carried 3 centuries of war in the way he occupied space. The absolute confidence of something that had survived everything the galaxy had thrown at it, and had concluded from that survival that it was, fundamentally, unkillable. His relic blade was drawn. His combi bolter was holstered. He had made a choice about what kind of statement he wanted this to be. He looked at Khorne and the Grey Knights and dismissed them with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to triage threats quickly. He looked at Pethrak with an expression that promised a conversation later, in private, with implements. Then he looked at the Doomslayer, and something in his bearing shifted. Not fear, not quite, but the complex recalibration of a warrior who had been hit by something once and was making sure he understood it better this time. "When Khorne has spoken," Varic said. His voice carried the resonant depth of a man whose vocal cords had been enhanced by blessings and time. "You belong to the blood god. Every skull you have taken since you arrived has fed his throne. Every act of violence in this place has been an offering, whether you intended it or not. You are already his." The Doomslayer said nothing. "You cannot refuse a god," Varic continued. "Not here. Not in the 41st Millennium, where the warp is real and the gods are present and their will is not metaphor, but physics. In your reality, perhaps you could fight your way free of divine attention. Here, Khorne's eye is on you, That is not a thing you escape by killing your way through it. A pause. Then, with something approaching genuine respect. Come willingly, fight for the blood god. You would be his greatest champion, the skulls you could take across eternity. The Doomslayer moved. Not toward Varic. Sideways, the one precise step, clearing a line of sight to the 4 berserkers who had entered behind the Chaos Lord and were currently attempting to flank wide around the ritual circle. 4 shots from the weapon at his hip, the same efficient economy he'd applied in Sector 19. And the flankers were down before Varic finished processing that the engagement had begun. Then he looked back at Varic and waited. The Chaos Lord laughed, short, sharp, almost appreciative. "Fine," he said, "the hard way." What followed was not elegant. It was not the kind of combat that Crane's Inquisitorial training had prepared him to observe with professional detachment. It was 2 things that had been built entirely for war engaging each other in a space too small for the scale of what they were. And the ritual chamber absorbed the consequences in structural damage that rained dust and ferrocrete fragments from the ceiling in a continuous commentary on the violence below. Varic was extraordinary. 3 centuries of Khornate blessing had elevated him beyond the standard of Chaos Space Marines in ways that were visible in real time. The speed of his recovery from impacts that should have ended the engagement, the adaptive intelligence of his blade work, the way he used the chamber's geometry to create angles the Slayer had to work to counter. He was not the frenzied berserker his warriors were. He was a craftsman of violence, and the craft was genuine. The Doomslayer was something else. Crane watched and cataloged with the obsessive attention of a man who knew he was seeing something that would define the rest of his career. The Slayer absorbed Varic's assault and responded not by matching it, but by operating in the spaces between it, finding the milliseconds of commitment in the Chaos Lord's blade work, the fractional overextension that 3 centuries of winning had bred into muscle memory, and exploiting them with a precision that suggested he had been reading Varic's fighting style since Sector 19, and had been waiting for this engagement to apply what he'd learned. He was also, Crane noted, pulling his strikes. Not much. Not in ways that reduced the effectiveness of the engagement. But the killing blow, the absolute termination that his capabilities clearly permitted, was being withheld. The Slayer was hitting Varic hard enough to damage, to disable, to control the engagement, not hard enough to finish it, not yet, because the berserkers were coming. The sounds from the corridors had resolved into proximity, hundreds of them, the thunder of their advance shaking the underhive infrastructure, and Marev's guardsmen were holding the eastern approaches with the desperate discipline of soldiers who had decided to die in place rather than retreat. And Mordax's flesh-tearers were buying minutes at the northern entrance that were running out. The Doomslayer broke off from Varic, leaving the Chaos Lord on one knee, head down, processing damage, and turned to face the western corridor where the first berserkers were already visible, pouring through in the mindless wave that was their tactical doctrine and their theological imperative simultaneously, And then something happened that Crane would spend years trying to correctly describe in his reports. The Doomslayer looked at Marev's guardsmen, the ones visible at the eastern entrance, 900 soldiers holding a line against impossible odds with laser guns and stubbornness, and the particular Cadian theology that said you held until you couldn't, and then you held some more. He looked at them for perhaps 2 seconds. Then he positioned himself at the western corridor entrance, between the Berserker Tide and the ritual chamber, and he stayed there, not advancing, not pursuing, holding ground, holding the line so that the humans behind him could hold theirs. Crane found, to his profound surprise, that he had to look away, not from the violence he had seen worse, from something in the posture of the armored figure standing at the corridor mouth that he had no professional category for and no personal experience of, and that hit him despite every inquisitorial instinct toward detachment, like a physical impact. He had spent 40 years determining what things were: demonic, heretical, Xenos, Imperial, threat, or asset. In 40 years, he had never seen something from beyond the boundaries of everything he knew stand between a tide of darkness and a group of exhausted ordinary soldiers who were not its people, in a war that was not its war, and simply refused to move. "Colonel Marev," he said into the Vox, his voice remarkably steady, "hold your positions. But something is holding the western approach." A pause from Marev's end. Then, quietly, "We know, Inquisitor. We can see it from here." Another pause. Longer. "I don't know what it is," she said, "but I know what it's doing." The Berserker Tide broke against him for 40 minutes, not metaphorically. The western corridor became a fixed point around which the entire tactical situation of the Tertius Underhive rotated, a hinge on which the battle turned, and the hinge held because the thing standing at it had been a hinge before, had been the fixed point in Hells that made the current engagement look manageable, and knew, with the bone-deep certainty of eons of experience, exactly how much it could absorb before the line moved. The answer was more than the Berserkers had. They came in waves because the corridor geometry forced waves, because 400 frenzied warriors in a space designed for maintenance crews and water reclamation equipment could not deploy as anything other than a sequential problem. And sequential problems were the Doomslayer's native language. He read the rhythm of the waves, the compression as the rear ranks pushed the front ranks forward, the fractional pauses as the tide reorganized after each engagement. And he worked within that rhythm with the efficiency of a machine that had been built for exactly this function and had been running continuously long enough to need no warm-up. He was hurt. The pauldron damage from the northern approach had been joined by new damage, a bolt round that had found a gap in the armor's left side, a chain axe that had scored across the helmet's right lens, leaving a crack in the visor that he had no way to repair and was managing by compensating the angle of his head to keep the cracked section out of his primary sightline. The glory kill regeneration that his armor systems facilitated was working, but slowly, the dimensional interference with his energy systems making the recovery rate a fraction of what it should have been. He was running on the last stages of what he'd arrived with, and he knew it, and he kept moving. Behind him, in the ritual chamber, the situation was its own separate crisis. Pethrak Sorn had resumed his work on the dimensional tear the moment the Western Corridor engagement began, because Pethrak's survival calculus had updated in real time, and the update was unambiguous. The thing standing at the corridor was going to either win or exhaust itself, and either outcome had implications for Pethrak's immediate future that he needed to get ahead of. Widening the tear to transit dimensions required 12 minutes of uninterrupted working. He had 11 of those minutes before Varic, recovered enough to be dangerous and furious enough to be irrational, pulled himself upright and crossed the chamber toward him. "Stop," Varic said. "I don't work for you," Pethrak said, without stopping. "Khorne wants it alive. Khorne wants it here. You open that tear and you defy the blood god's direct will." Varic raised his relic blade. "I will execute you for heresy against the brass throne." "You will execute me regardless," Pethrak said, with the flat certainty of a man who had correctly read the situation. "I made a mistake that cost Khorne an investment and cost your warband 300 warriors. You were always going to kill me. The only question was when." His hands kept moving. "So, my choices are die, now having done nothing, or die, later having done something. I prefer the second option." Varic moved toward him. Crane's bolt pistol fired twice. The shots didn't drop Varic. He was too enhanced, too blessed, too saturated with Khorne's favor for 2 bolt rounds to do more than stagger him. But they stopped him, and the Grey Knights were already moving, interposing between the Chaos Lord and the sorcerer, with the practiced efficiency of warriors who had trained for exactly this kind of chaotic, multi-threat environment. "Let him finish," Crane said. Varic turned to look at the Inquisitor with an expression of absolute incomprehension. "You're protecting a chaos sorcerer." "I'm managing a situation," Crane said. "There's a difference." He kept the bolt pistol level. "The being in that corridor is currently preventing 400 berserkers from overrunning this chamber and killing everyone in it, including you. When it finishes doing that, it will come back here. And if that tear isn't ready, I don't know what it does next. I do know I don't want to find out." A pause. Then, "You also don't want it stranded here permanently, because a being that has spent 12 hours doing what it's done to your warband, with no way home and no reason to stop, that doesn't serve Khorne. That doesn't serve anyone. That's just an engine running until something breaks, and the thing that breaks won't be the engine." Varic stared at him. The Grey Knights held their position. Pethrak's hands kept moving, and the sounds from the Western Corridor were changing. The rhythm of the Berserker waves was breaking down, not because they were stopping, but because there weren't enough of them left to maintain the pressure. The tide was running out. When the Doomslayer came back through the corridor entrance, he was moving differently, still upright, still controlled, but the compensation patterns had multiplied. More weight on the right side, the left arm cycling weapons with a fraction less speed than it had 12 hours ago, the cracked helmet visor giving him a lopsided aspect that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than less. the way a weapon with visible damage looks more credible than a pristine one. He looked at the chamber. He looked at Varic, held at Grey Knight gunpoint. He looked at Khorne. He looked at Pithrak. Pithrak turned from the tear. "It's ready," he said. The dimensional tear had widened to roughly 2 meters across, its edges stable, its interior showing not the howling madness of the warp, but something else, a darkness that was different in quality, deeper, carrying the distant suggestion of fire and ruin that was, in context, almost welcoming. The Doomslayer walked toward it. Varic pulled free of the Grey Knights with a surge of chaos-blessed strength that bought him 2 seconds and used them to cross the chamber in a dead sprint. Relic blade raised, and what he was attempting was not tactical. It was theological. Khorne's will, delivered personally by the only servant in the room still capable of attempting it. The Doomslayer turned from the tier, caught the blade arm, redirected the momentum, put Varic into the ground with an impact that cracked the ritual circle's remaining stonework and left the Chaos Lord lying still in a way that was not death, but was the next closest thing. The absolute, enforced stillness of a body that had simply run out of capacity to continue. Silence. The Doomslayer stood over Varic for a moment. Then he looked at the Chaos Lord's relic blade, lying on the ground beside its owner's outstretched hand. He looked at it with an attention that was different from his combat assessment. Something almost evaluative, the way he had looked at the burning city when he first arrived. He left it there. He turned back to the tear, walked to its edge, stopped. He turned to look at the room one final time, at Khorne, at the Grey Knights, at Pithrak, at the distant sounds of Marev's guardsmen and Mordax's flesh-tearers holding their lines in corridors that had gone quiet. The pale lenses swept the room with the same unhurried assessment they had applied to everything since Sector 19. Taking it in, filing it. Whatever internal architecture processed experience in that ancient, scarred mind was doing what it always did, noting the territory, the threats, the people who had held their ground. Khorne found himself standing straighter without deciding to. "For whatever it's worth," the Inquisitor said, to something he wasn't sure could understand him and suspected understood him perfectly. "You held the line. Whatever you are, wherever you're from," he paused. "The Emperor," he stopped, reconsidered. "Someone should know what happened here." The helmet tilted, that fractional, characteristic tilt. Then the Doomslayer stepped through the tear, and the dimensional breach sealed behind him with a sound like a held breath finally released, and the ritual chamber was quiet for the first time since the crater appeared in Sector 19. Above them, through 4 levels of underhive infrastructure and burning city and smoke-filled sky, something vast and ancient and made entirely of rage let out a sound that mortals within 3 systems felt as pressure behind the eyes and copper on the tongue. Khorne had wanted the Doomslayer. The Doomslayer was a warrior of the Imperium, a man who had been born to fight. He had been raised in the slums of the City of the Dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive, and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums of the City of the Dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive. and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums of the city of the dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive, and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums of the city of the dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive, and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums of the city of the dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive, and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums of the city of the dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive, and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums of the city of the dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive, and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums of the city of the dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive, and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums of the city of the dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive, and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums of the city of the dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive, and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums of the city of the dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive, and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums of the city of the dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive, and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums of the city of the dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive, and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums of the city of the dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive, and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums of the city of the dead, a place where the dead were not dead, but alive, and where the living were not living, but dead. He had been raised in the slums. Khorne had wanted the Doomslayer. The Doomslayer had declined. The aftermath of Caelum Tertius took 6 months to fully document, and considerably longer to fully understand. The Khornate incursion collapsed within 48 hours of the Ritual Chamber's events, not because the remaining Berserkers lost the will to fight, which was theologically impossible, but because the command structure that had been directing them toward a coherent objective had been removed. Varic the Unbroken survived, technically, in the sense that his body continued to function after 3 days of Chaos Apothecary intervention, but what emerged from that intervention was diminished in ways that went beyond the physical. The Chaos Lord, who had laughed in Sector 19 and felt genuine surprise for the first time in centuries, did not laugh again. He fought because Berserkers always fought, but the intelligence behind the fighting had gone somewhere quieter, and the Crimson Tithe fragmented without him into smaller war bands that the 14th Cadian remnant and the Flesh Terrors dismantled over the following weeks with the methodical efficiency of soldiers who had been handed a winnable situation and intended to win it. Pithrak Sorn was taken into Inquisitorial custody. His cooperation in closing the dimensional tear was noted in Crane's formal report and immediately classified at the highest available clearance level, because the formal report also noted that a Chaos Sorcerer's dimensional transit research had successfully opened a stable breach to a non-warp adjacent reality, which was the kind of capability that the Inquisition needed to understand and control before anyone else understood it existed. What happened to Pethrak after that initial custody transfer was not recorded in any document available to personnel below Crane's clearance level. Pethrak himself had understood, when he made his choice in the ritual chamber, that survival was the best available outcome, and that survival in Inquisitorial custody was a specific and demanding kind of survival. He had made his peace with it. Colonel Iseult Marev received the Macarian Cross for the 14th Cadian Remnant's defense of the Manufactorum Belt, an honor that she accepted on behalf of her 941 survivors, with the Cadian combination of pride and practicality, noting in her own private log that the decoration was appropriate for what her soldiers had done, and did not begin to address what they had witnessed doing it. She wrote 3 drafts of a supplementary report about the unidentified combatant, tore up all 3, and submitted a 4th that described an unknown Imperial agent of exceptional capability, whose identity was classified above her clearance level. It was a lie that was also, in all the ways that mattered, completely true. Trooper Harsk was promoted to sergeant. He did not talk about what he had seen, but occasionally, in the years that followed, when junior soldiers asked him what the worst posting he'd ever survived was, he would describe 3 weeks of Khornate assault on Caelum Tertius in considerable detail and then go quiet, and the soldiers who knew him well enough understood that the quiet was about something after the assault, something he didn't have words for, and they were wise enough not to push. Captain Mordax returned to his company with a report for the Flesh-Tearers chapter master that he had rewritten 11 times during the transit home. The final version was precise, accurate, and completely inadequate. It described a combatant of extraordinary capability whose methods, motivations, and origin defied classification. It noted that the combatant had held a defensive position to protect civilian and Imperial military personnel without being asked, ordered, or incentivized to do so. It concluded with an assessment that Mordax had never written before and suspected he would never write again. This being was not Imperial. It was not allied to any known faction. It operated according to principles I cannot fully articulate. But if those principles had a name, I believe that name would be: it protects what should be protected and destroys what should be destroyed, and it does not require permission or recognition to know the difference. The chapter master read the report twice. He filed it in a restricted archive and said nothing. Inquisitor Valdris Crane spent 6 months writing the full account of Caelum Tertius, not the formal report. That was done in a week, efficient and classified and carefully calibrated to convey necessary information without conveying the parts that couldn't be processed through normal inquisitorial frameworks. The full account was personal, written in a private cipher, never submitted anywhere. In it, he asked questions he could not answer. What was the Doomslayer? What reality had produced something that hell itself feared? What did it mean that Khorne, the blood god, the deity of violence and rage, a being of infinite appetite and infinite power, had wanted him and had been refused? The last entry in Crane's private account read, The blood god is hungry for something he cannot have. In my experience, that condition does not resolve. It intensifies. I do not know if the being that came through that tear will ever return to the 41st millennium. I do not know if it is aware that something vast and terrible now carries its specific absence like a wound. I do not know what Khorne does with hunger that cannot be satisfied. I know what the Slayer did with his. He pointed it at the darkness and walked forward. In this millennium, in this age of ruin and endless war, I have met saints and heroes and monsters and gods. I have never met anything that walked forward the way he did. Not with faith, not with ideology, not with the promise of reward or the fear of consequence. Just forward, because the darkness was there, and he was the answer to it. I find I have no inquisitorial category for that. I find I don't need one. In the warp on the brass throne, something vast and ancient and made entirely of rage sat with its hunger and its frustration and the particular eternal fury of a god who had been denied. Around the throne, the rivers of blood ran their endless course, and the mountains of skulls grew their endless height, and the machinery of divine appetite continued its roaring work. But at the edges of that roaring, in the spaces between the fury, something else had taken root. Something small and strange and entirely at odds with the blood god's nature. Khorne remembered. Not with longing. Gods did not long, exactly. Not with respect. Respect implied an equal. But with the specific, consuming fixation of something that had seen, for the first and only time in its existence, a being whose violence was not offered to any god, not elevated by any faith, not corrupted by any hunger. Just a man, just the war, just forward. The brass throne burned, the rivers ran, the skulls accumulated, and somewhere at the edge of the immaterium, in the space where divine attention bleeds into the fabric of reality, the blood god waited with the patience of something that had never needed patience before and was learning it now, one dark millennium at a time. The rift was closed. The Slayer was gone. But gods have long memories, and the 41st millennium had longer nights. In the end, the Doomslayer left Caelum Tertius the way he had arrived, without ceremony, without declaration, without the kind of mythologizing that the Imperium reflexively applied to anything it couldn't categorize and couldn't control. He had come through a tear in reality, fought because fighting was the answer the darkness always understood, held a line for soldiers who were not his soldiers in a war that was not his war, and stepped back through the wound in the world when the wound was ready to close. He left behind a broken warband, a humbled chaos lord, 941 soldiers who would never fully describe what they had witnessed, and a god with a hunger it had never felt before. He left behind no ideology, no allegiance, no monument. Just the dead that deserved to be dead, and the living that deserved to live. In the 41st millennium, where everything was theology and politics and the grinding machinery of civilization devouring itself in slow motion, that simplicity was the most radical thing he could have done. Khorne would not forget him. The Imperium would not fully record him. The darkness would not stop. But somewhere beyond the tear, in a reality defined by its own endless war, Something moved through hell with its weapons ready and its purpose unchanged. And it did not know, or did not care, that a god was hungry for it across the boundary of everything. It only knew what was ahead of it. It only knew forward. The Emperor protects. More stories await.